everyone. My name is Chris Chappell. I'm the Joshi Professor of Indic Comparative Theology here at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles. And we have had a very windy, beautiful day with, sadly, some smoke off on the horizon. And we are gathering on a very auspicious occasion, and that many people pass through many rites of passage. And the particular rite of passage for people within academia is the defense of a doctoral dissertation. And a doctoral dissertation takes a great deal of blood, sweat, and tears, takes a great deal of thought, takes the attention of many people who read it, many people who have ideas about how it could be improved. And our speaker tonight, Dr. Zoë Slatoff, has successfully gone through this rite of passage and defended her dissertation, Lancaster University in the United Kingdom. And Zoe, known to many of you, has really an august history with the tradition of yoga and the study of Sanskrit. She discovered while she was a student at Cooper Union, while on a little bit of an excursion, that engineering did not make her heart soar, that in fact it was the performance of yoga, the listening to Sanskrit, and probably above all, and this is hopefully true of all scholars such as myself, is that we just plain love to learn. She went back again and again, and along the way, during her time in New York, she did her undergraduate degree at Columbia University and a master's at Columbia, focusing on Sanskrit literature and all things India and philosophical. And as she moved within the great world of New York, she created a yogashala in the tradition of the Mysore School, and for 12 years owned and operated a remarkable place that I had the good fortune to visit some 8 or 9 years ago. And it was during the first year, it was during the period when the first graduating class was of the Master of Arts Yoga Studies here, was completing a 6-week residency at Covenant House, a place for supportive housing. And I had the good fortune not only of being an early reviewer of Yogāvatāraṇaṃ, her magnificent Sanskrit textbook, but also had the good fortune of visiting her studio. And she showed me her work in progress, and I said, Zoe, you really have to take this forward and into the world. And sure enough, eventually, we now can refer to Zoe as Dr. Slatoff. She is clinical professor full-time of yoga studies, currently teaching Sanskrit at the introductory level as well as the second-year level. And she's also this semester overseeing the course that we mentor our graduate students who are interested in working with undergraduate populations, teaching them yoga. And next semester, she'll be teaching a course in Indian philosophy, as well as helping our completing class to finish their Master of Arts in Yoga Studies thesis projects. So with that, I will turn this over to Dr. Slatoff, and let's just give her a little bit of applause.
Both Chris's fault and his credit that I've done a Ph.D. and have devoted all this time to the Aparokṣānubhūti which I'm going to talk about today. But thank you all for being here, those who are here in person and on Zoom, and those who are asleep and watching this later. So thank you. And I'm just going to put up the slides. So I guess what I'd like to do, I mean, I've spent, as I said, many years on writing a dissertation on this text. And I sort of, but what I'd like to do is sort of tell the story of this.
Do you want to move here? They have hard to hear.
They can't hear.
Yeah, do you want to move to here? Or use your computer? Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
And I'm going to perform in surround sound. Just kidding. Is that better? Can you hear me? Okay, so what I'd like to do is sort of tell the story of this text. I've been saying to my Sanskrit students how we read verses out of context, and we have to do that in order to, in order to learn the grammar and in order to sort of get the fundamentals. But what's really fun and exciting after that is going back into context and reading a text in its entirety and then trying to contextualize it historically. And so what I'd like to do is sort of tell you the story of this text. This is a manuscript of the Aparokṣānubhūti, and I've looked at many of them, and to let the text speak itself and tell you its story, but also to put it into context with other texts. And this text that I have spent the last 5 or 6 years on is called the Aparokṣānubhūti. I will tell you what that means in a moment, or I will let the text tell you what it means. But just to give you a little background for those who are unfamiliar with it, it is attributed to Shankaracharya, who lived in the 8th century, but for many reasons, which I will go through some of, it seems quite impossible that he actually wrote it. Many texts have been attributed to him. And I think it's probably more likely to have been written in the late 15th to mid 16th century as part of this sort of Advaitic movement to kind of incorporate the yoga people, really. So there was this big growth of Hatha yoga texts and sort of Hatha yoga practice and community, and all texts arise, they don't arise in a bubble, they arise in conversation with whatever else is going on. And so this text is largely speaking to these Hatha yoga texts, which were sort of really getting into pretty sort of serious formation by this point. The Hatha Pradipika, which is probably the most well-known Hatha yoga texts, is 15th century, and that's a compilation of other Hatha yoga texts sort of starting in the 12th, 13th century. But I will talk more about that later. The text itself is 144 verses, which is very manageable. My Sanskrit reading group, who've just finished my book not that long ago, we've just read the entire text. And one of my students just said that I made it a page turner, so I hope to do that. I kind of think it is. So it's a short text. It's meant to teach Advaita in sort of understandable bite-sized chunks to a sort of, to a general audience. But it starts out, the first 2/3 of the text teaches a traditional method of vichara, which means inquiry or reflection. But it then does this strange thing. It incorporates a 15-part Raja Yoga into this Advaita philosophy. Within those 15 parts are the 8 limbs parts of Patanjali, the Ashtanga, but he redefines all of them, and we will look at those as we get there. And then at the very end, he says very begrudgingly, okay, if you still have not realized Brahman, which, as we will see over and over and over again, is the point, you can do some Hatha yoga. So this is just sort of an overview, but we will go into the details. So it starts off as, I think, good texts do by telling you what it is and what it's going to do and who it's for. So it's very, straightforward in that way. The Aparokṣānubhūti, which means immediate awareness, meaning immediate awareness of the self. So the realization that the Atman is the same as Brahman, the individual self, the same as the universal self. It is surely taught why. It is taught moksha siddhaye, for the attainment of moksha or liberation. And then it says, only by good people, sadbhireva, by good virtuous people, prayatnena, with great effort, it is to be considered, vikshaniya muhur muhu, again and again. And I don't know if I'm a Sat person, but I have definitely considered it again and again. So I haven't reached liberation yet, though, so I'm still doing it. So again, I'm going to go through some verses just to give you a sense of the text. And the text is quite repetitive. It has a lot of refrains. So it's clearly been taught through oral tradition. For example, the end of this one, the fourth pada, vichara soyami drishaha. There are a whole bunch of verses that end in this way, such as this inquiry, or this reflection goes like that. And he sort of gives us these various vicharas, which are sort of inquiries or reflections to help one come to this realization, hopefully. And so ajnana prabhavam sarvam, everything is produced by ajnana, by ignorance, but it melts away by jnana, by knowledge. And then our sankalpas, our various intentions are the karta, they are the creator, such as this inquiry. So they're sort of like little riddles that you can kind of contemplate and think through. And there's a whole bunch of these. And so, and I should say, like many texts, this text sort of starts out for the sort of more advanced student. So before this, I didn't give you this, but it gives the traditional Advaitic prerequisites, the four practices. I'm not going to go into them, but the sort of traditional Advaitic prerequisites for studying. But he really starts off with an advanced audience. So like the Yoga Sutra does, for those of you who are familiar with it, right? We start with Samadhi. And then after that, if you're enlightened, great, you're there. But if you're not, then he gives you the sadhana pada, the chapter on practice. And so this is similar. He sort of starts off with this kind of more advanced, just get to it. Realize that Atman is the same as Brahman, and sort of do it into sort of more, not intellectually, but kind of through jnana, through knowledge. And then, but if we're still reading, which we probably will be, because I always still am, we will get to the point where he gives us these other options. So he talks a bunch about vichara, and then he tells us, what is ignorance? What is ignorance? Ignorance is, the self is pure, made of knowledge, and the body is impure, made of flesh. Very obvious. But they, meaning the ignorant people, they see oneness of these two things. They see aikyam. They think they're the same thing. Kim ajñānamata param. What is ignorance but this? And there are, again, many verses with this refrain. So he sort of tells us, like, this is the trap. The trap is mistaking the self for the body, right? And this sort of misidentification, which this text talks a lot about. But he also tells us what knowledge is. And right, I am without change, nirvikara. I'm without form, nirakara. I am without blemish, niravadya. And aham avyaya, I am undecaying. Naham deho hyasarupo. I am surely not the body whose form is asat, non-existence. Jnanam mityuchate budaihi. This is said to be knowledge by the wise. So he's really trying to tell us what's going on here. This is ignorance. This is knowledge. Be a wise person. That's what we're trying to do here. But then he starts to tell us, how people get confused, right? I am known as the drashtra. I am known as the seer. The deha, the body, is established as the drishya, the seen. But, we have this idea that this body belongs to me. This body is mine. And so from this, how could the body be the self? How can we make this mistake? And the text again goes on. It has a bunch of verses that end this way. Katam syat deha puman. How could the body be the self? How can we make this mistake? The self is clearly, beyond the body. And just to contextualize this, because we will be talking about the Yoga Sutra as a reference point, the Yoga Sutra also talks about what? The drashtra and the drishya, right? The seer and the seen. And just to sort of bring you up to speed here in the Yoga Sutra, the sutra before this is Hayam Dukkhamanagatam, one that I say over and over again to my Sanskrit students, right? Future suffering is to be avoided, right? Suffering that is anagatam, not yet come, is to be avoided. Usually I'm saying it's by doing your Sanskrit homework, but that's not what they meant here. And so that's what comes before this. But then he tells us what's the hetu, the cause of that future suffering, which is to be avoided. It is this samyoga. It's this conjunction, or in this case, even confusion of the drashtra and the drishya, of the seer and the seen. So we have the same problem, right? We end up with kind of a different solution, but we have the same problem. In the Yoga Sutra, though, it says it's actually this conjunction of the Shakti, this same samyoga of the powers of the self and of the seer and the seen. This is actually the hetu, it's the cause of understanding them. So it's both the problem and the solution. And then he tells us what causes this conjunction: avidya, ignorance, right? Ignorance is what gets us into this mess, both in sort of both cases. And then, but here, what's the end game here in the Yoga Sutra? And this is sort of one of the main things I want to talk about, right? So it says, from the absence of that ignorance, of that avidya, there's the absence of this samyoga, of this conjunction of the seer and the seen, or this confusion. And then he says, that hanam, that liberation, what is it? It's the kaivalya. It's the isolation of the seer. And this is the end game of the Yoga Sutra, right? It's kaivalya. It's the isolation and the separation of Purusha from Prakriti. And this comes as a big surprise to lots of people in the yoga world, right? Ask most people what yoga is and what is it? Oh, it's union. You know, we all want it to mean union, and it's very much come to, in many ways, mean union. And part of why I was interested in the Aparokṣānubhūti is that it's an important piece in that story of how it came to mean union. But once upon a time in the Yoga Sutra, which is sort of the most popular yoga text, just without really knowing what the full meaning is this kaivalya, this separation of Purusha, which is the self, from Prakriti, which is everything else. And so, right, this is the opposite of the Advaitic goal, which is the oneness of Atman and Brahman. And so I'm going to sort of see how these two things come together, but bear in mind that the original aim was actually the opposite. So this kaivalya. And so to get back to our text, right, what does he tell us? Just as the Bhranti, the illusion of a gata, of a pot in mrit, in clay, or the presence of silver in a pearl oyster, these are sort of the standard examples of mistaken knowledge. So just as these illusions, so too, when Brahman is being realized, and when it's being realized, one does not see jivatam, one does not see individuality. All you see is oneness, right? So you're not seeing these separate purushas as you do in yoga. You're seeing this oneness. You don't see the jivaness, the individuality. So different intentions here. And so that's all kind of traditional Advaitic stuff, along with just a little overview of the yoga philosophy. But here's where this text starts to get different. And this is one of the reasons that we know that this text was not written by Shankara. So there's this thing called prarabdha karma. So there are different kinds of karma, right? And prarabdha karma, just for a teeny little Sanskrit lesson. So prarabdha karma, it comes from the verb prarab, which means to begin or undertake. This is the past passive participle for those who that means something to, meaning commenced, begun, been undertaken. And so what is prarabdha karma? It is karma that has already begun, right? You've already started this karma. It's ripe. And so Shankara says, you shoot an arrow, right? And even if you stop the arrow, what happens? It has to fall down to the ground. Or the other example, if you have a potter's wheel and it's spinning and you stop it, it has to slow down, right? You can't just boom, it's not that, it doesn't just stop. And so according to Shankara, even if you have this realization, this ultimate realization, you still have to play out your prarabdha karma. You got to finish it out. However, the Aparokṣānubhūti says, no, that's not true. After you have this tattva jnana, this knowledge of the truth, prarabdha karma, it's gone. Na eva vidyate, it doesn't even exist anymore. And this is because the body, the deha, the body and such things, they're not real. Just like a dream when you wake up, right? You wake up from a dream and none of that was real. Same thing, he says, once you realize it's gone. So this is his sort of unique, I mean, there are others who have this view, but unique view from Shankara and from much of the Advaitic tradition. So, but then we sort of wonder, you know, why did the text talk about prarabdha karma? So according to him, you know, he asks, why does this prarabdha karma exist? And he say, the Shastras, the sacred texts, they talk about the Shrutis, they speak of prarabdha karma for the artha, for the purpose of awakening ajnani jana, ignorant people, right? So if we're still here, we're not enlightened, you know, we have to play out our prarabdha karma, and he's going to help us with this. So thank you. We don't know who wrote it again, but he wants to help us. We're still reading here. So then we get into the last third of the text, which to me is sort of the most interesting part. And he tells us, we're still reading, surely for the labdha, for the attainment of what was spoken about, what was purva spoken of previously, I will explain the Tri Panch Anga, the 15 parts, the 15 limbs of, so he includes Patanjali's 8, but he's got 7 more that he's gonna add. I'm not gonna tell you all of them, but you know, we'll get some of them. And he says, and yet, and I'm gonna come back to this word yet in a few minutes, and yet by means of all of these, nididhyasanam, contemplation alone is to be practiced. So he's going to tell us these angas, that they're not for the purpose that Patanjali told you they were for. I'm going to give you a new purpose. And so just for a moment, I want to look at this word nididhyasana, this other sort of big important word. So nididhyasana comes from the verb nidhyai. Dhyai is the same root as dhyana, meditation. So this means to think of, meditate upon, remember, meditate deeply on. And this nididhyasana is a profound repeated meditation. And it's part of the traditional Advaitic triad, Shravana, Manana, and nididhyasana, hearing, reflection, and contemplation. This sort of originates in a passage in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, where Yajnavalkya is telling Maitreyi, this is to be, it's to be seen, it's to be heard, it's to be reflected on, it's to be contemplated, meaning the self is. But it becomes this triad, and originally, what is meant to be heard, reflected on, and contemplated is the Mahavakyas, right? The Aham Brahmasmi, I am Brahman, or Soham, I am that, or, you know, any of the other Tattvamasi, you are that, any of the Mahavakyas, you hear that, you reflect on it, you contemplate it, boom, you realize Brahman, traditionally. But over time, you know, that didn't work for everybody, and they start to want to bring other people into their fold. You know, look at those people over there doing Hatha Yoga. Let's bring them in, you know. And so they start, and this doesn't just happen in this text, this happens in other texts. They start to bring them in by widening this definition of nididhyasana. So it's sort of, nididhyasana is not just contemplation of this, but it becomes a broader meditation, which in this text will include all of those 15 angas, right? So yet by means of all of these angas, nididhyasana alone is to be practiced. So he's telling us, for him, these 15 angas are going to be for the purpose of nididhyasana. So he's sort of fitting that inside this traditional triad. And I just want to show you a little bits of the, I'm not going to give you too much of the commentaries, but I've translated also about 4 commentaries on this text, none of which have ever been translated before. So it's kind of a little bit of muddy water, some of them. But the Deepika is the most common, the most popular. And it's attributed to Vidyaranya, who lived in the 14th century. And so since we're saying the text was written in the 15th, 16th century, I'm going to say that Vijayaranya did not write the commentary. So I would say the Dipika is probably not too much after the text itself. So maybe 16th, 17th century. It seems to be the most well known. There are many more copies of it in manuscript libraries around India. There is a published edition of it. And some of the commentaries do also refer to it. And it's a pretty sort of straight, it's more of a philosophical commentary than the kind of commentary which gives you synonyms, which is the fun kind of commentary that I keep telling people about. But it's an interesting commentary, and it adds to our sort of philosophical understanding. So the Dipika it's called the Dipika, like a lamp on this text. It says, thus by the discourse in the text so far, it was explained that the best means to liberation for the Mukhya Adhikaran, the most qualified aspirant, preceded by the four means. These were the prerequisites I mentioned that begin with detachment. So the best means is inquiry into the Upanishadic statements alone, by way of knowledge of the direct perception of Brahman as not different from Atman, right? This is what we've had so far in the first 99 verses. But then he tells us, now for the Manda Adhikaran, the mediocre aspirant. This is, the sort of the slow, Manda means like slow-minded student. So I always think of like the first part of the text is the A student, this part's the B student, and we're going to get to the C student at the very end. So we're sort of in the B student category, for whom the knowledge of direct perception of Brahman does not arise, even though you reflect on it repeatedly. I've been reading this text for 5 or 6 years. I haven't gotten there yet. So I am a Manda Adhikaran, apparently, through the obstacles of slow-mindedness and attachment to the sense objects. So the teachers now for us introduce this dhyana yoga, the yoga of meditation, together with the means of doing it, right? These 15 angas, intending the best method, which is being intent on Brahman alone. So the purpose is still Brahman. He's just going to try to talk to the rest of us in a language maybe we can understand. And he says this word yet that I told you we would come back to, it indicates that this is for the attainment of liberation by means of characteristics that are different from those given in Patanjali's system. Again, the text itself doesn't say this, but the commentary does. So, unless we don't know that this is what the text itself meant, but we can tell that it's sort of setting itself up in distinction to Patanjali's angas. So, right, contemplate these angas, they are for nididhyasana, they're for contemplation. They're not for whatever Patanjali meant them for. And what did Patanjali mean them for? So, viveka kyatir viplava hanopayaha. He tells us the means to hana, to liberation, is this aviplava, this uninterrupted viveka kyati, discriminative discernment. And he tells us that from the practice of the limbs of yoga, yoga anganushthanad, when there is the destruction of impurities, another locative absolute for you guys, we're talking about. When there is the destruction of impurities from this practice of the limbs of yoga, the light of knowledge, the jnana dipti, it arises, culminating in this viveka kyati, this discriminative discernment, right? So his idea of why so for him, you're doing these yoga angas for discernment, which, is a different discernment, because remember, the end game is kaivalya. So it's different than for this realization that Atman is the same as Brahman. Back to the Aparokṣānubhūti, he tells us, Nityabhyasa dhrite prapti, without constant practice, one might not attain this self that is satchit, right? That is characterized by being in consciousness. Therefore, somebody who is a jignasu, somebody who wants to know, meaning wants to know Brahman, what should you do? Nididhyasate, you should contemplate Brahman for a long time, for this highest aim, which is moksha, or liberation. And then I'm just going to go through not all of the angas, because we would be here all night, but some of the angas, just to give you a little bit of a sense. So he starts off just like Patanjali with yama. And what does he say yama is? Sarvam brahmeti vijnanad indriya grama samyamaha. So from the vijnana, from the realization that what? Sarvam brahma iti. Everything is Brahman. There is the samyama, there is the control of the group of the senses. This is declared to be restraint. And it is abhyasaniya. It is to be practiced over and over and over again. Muhur muhuhu, right? So he's defining it in terms of Brahman. And he's going to define everything in terms of Brahman. He is going to just keep hitting us over the head with Brahman. That's what he's doing. But the commentary tells us, it is declared that this is restraint. The meaning is not just ahimsa, right? Not just nonviolence, which is what? This is what Patanjali tells us yama is. Ahimsa, nonviolence, satya, truthfulness, asteya, non-stealing, brahmacharya, celibacy, and aparigraha, non-grasping, right? So he is constantly defining his angas in distinction to Patanjali, and this would have been well known, so he doesn't even need to say it. And that's true in all of these texts. You know, they quote people, they're happy to quote people without giving attribution. You know, it's sort of there's an assumed knowledge, and it's not plagiarism. The commentary, the Dipika in particular, all of the time is, you know, quoting texts and not attributing them. And then niyama. What is niyama? The smooth flow of one type of mental state of Brahman and the disregard of other mental states that are not about Brahman, right? This is what niyama is. It is the parananda, the highest bliss, and it is regularly practiced by the wise. So again, just keeping the thought, Brahman, 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 take the other ones out. This is what niyama is. It is not what Patanjali says. Patanjali says it is shaucha, it is purity, it is santosha, contentment, it is tapas, discipline, svadhyaya, self-study, and it is ishvara pranidhana, surrender to ishvara, right? So again, he's sort of defining these things differently. And so I'm skipping along a bit here. He's got some other, he's got one for desha, place. He's got an anga for place. He's got one for kala, time. So his angas are sort of, yeah, they're a little different and adding different dimensions, but he does get to asana. And how does he define asana, posture? A posture is something in which with sukhena, with sukha, with ease, with comfort, right? This brahmachintanam, that is ajastram, unceasing, unstoppable, unstopping meditation on Brahman may arise. This is posture. You're doing your yoga practice and you're just there and you're thinking Brahman, 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 Brahman. That is asana, not any other one that destroys ease. So if you're doing a yoga pose and it makes you want to scream or, you know, and it's sukhanashanam, it's destroying ease, he says that's not asana. So he has a very particular bent on this. And, you know, it's not that dissimilar from what Patanjali says, right? What does Patanjali say? Sthira sukhamasana, posture is that which is steady and comfortable or becomes steadily comfortable, depending how you translate it. And he then goes on, I don't think I gave you this one, but he goes on to say in the Aparokṣānubhūti, the posture that he recommends is siddhasana, which is the posture par excellence in pretty much all the yoga texts. Also, you know, they tell it's a pretty comfortable seat. You could sit there for 3 hours. You're meant to sit there for 3 hours, whatever it is. So it's got to be pretty comfortable. But again, he defines siddhasana. I don't have that one here, but he defines it in terms of Brahman, right? It's the posture where you can most easily conceive of Brahman. But then he gives us these other angas. This one is about equilibrium of the limbs of the body. So they're sort of tangential to asana. And he tells us one should know that equilibrium of the angas, the limbs of the body, it is, what is it? It's being absorbed in Brahman, in the Sama Brahman, the constant Brahman. But he tells us if there's not this, there is no samanatvam, there is no equilibrium at all. What is it? It is merely straightening up shushka vrikshavat. That's one of my favorite compounds, like a dried up tree. Right? And so what's he doing? He's making fun of the hatha yogis. He's trying to tell them, you know, come over here. Like, do you really want to do that? All you're doing is, you know, pretend vrikshasana, right? You're sort of like pretending to be a tree. That's not asana. That's not equilibrium, you know, and it's quite, I mean, this text is quite funny. He's sort of both like disparaging and funny at the same time. And he goes on. So he talks about drishti. This is another one of the angas. He says, having made one's drishti full of jnana, full of knowledge, one should see the jagat, the universe, as full of what? Brahman, right? We can all do this now. That case is the Parama Uddhara, is the most exalted. Nanasagravalokani, not looking at the tip of the nose, right? He's saying the drishti that, we've often practiced in asana, or even Bhagavad Gita even talks about, this kind of drishti. He's saying that's not drishti. That's because that's dualistic, right? If you're looking at a point, it's dualistic. And so he's saying the only way drishti can be non-dualistic, the only way it can be Advaitic is by making it internal. And so this is one of the other commentaries. It says, it's not the one looking at the tip of the nose, because that binds the self to the body. Therefore, the seeing of the self as Brahman with no distinction, that alone is stability of the gaze. That alone is to be practiced by the discerning. And then there's this is actually a Marathi commentary, which I can only read a little bit of since I don't really know Marathi, but he just says, fools will hold the tip of the nose. So, you don't want to be one of those fools. So then he goes on back to the limbs of the angas of Patanjali to tell us about pranayama. What's pranayama? From the idea, the bhavana, the conception that all the states of the mind are what? Brahman. That control of the mental states is breath control. And it's interesting here, right? Because how does he define pranayama? I don't think I have this up there, but almost in the way that Patanjali describes yoga. What is yoga? Yoga is chitta vritti nirodha. What is pranayama for this guy? Nirodha sarvavrittinam, same thing. It's the nirodha, it's the stilling or the cessation of the fluctuating mental states. But for Patanjali, this is yoga. For him, this is only pranayama. It's like, we're going way beyond that. And again, it's not a coincidence that he uses the same terminology. Everybody would have known this. And then the commentary says, because of the dependence of the breath on the mind, by that very control of the mind, there is control of the breath. But he says, but not only by control of the breath, which is what Patanjali says, right? It's accepted by Patanjali as their control of the mind. He says it doesn't work that way. You can't sit here and breathe and expect to control your mind in that way. He says, you have to actually, by controlling your mind, then you'll control your breath, because we're working through the mind. And what does Patanjali say? Tasmin sati shvasa prashvasa yorgati vicheda pranayama. When you've accomplished posture, that's when you have pranayama. What is it? It's the regulation, the vicheda of the shvasa and the prashvasa, of the inhalation and the exhalation. And then a few sutras later, he tells us that there's a higher pranayama, but eventually the covering of the illumination of knowledge is weakened and the mind becomes fit for dharana, for concentration. But again, the way in is the breath towards the mind, as opposed to, we're working with the mind and that'll control your breath. And one of the other commentaries tells us, right, the control of the mental states from the knowledge of the self as Brahman, that alone is pranayama, not any other that is uncontrolled with the characteristics of hatha yoga, because that's fake. So I know he's a little mean, don't take it personally. And just to sort of give you a little taste of the Hatha Pradipika, right? Because the Hatha Pradipika tells us what? We can work both ways. Chale vate chalam chitam, nischale nischalam bhavet. When the breath is unsteady, the mind is unsteady. When the breath is steady, the mind may become steady. The yogi attains stanutvam, stability, and he says, tato vayum nirodhayet. Therefore what? Therefore one should control the breath. So he's like Patanjali, but even more so telling you, control the breath, that will help you control the mind. And, this feels a lot more accessible, right? He's giving us actual practical tools, but again, not according to the Aparokṣānubhūti. What is inhalation and exhalation for the Aparokṣānubhūti? It says, the negation of the manifold world is the breath called exhalation. The mental state, I am Brahman alone, is the inhalation. So you exhale, make the world go away. Inhale, I am Brahman alone. Exhale, make the world go away. Inhale, I am Brahman alone. It's kind of a nice meditation. I don't know, it's not what I would necessarily consider pranayama, but you could do it with the breath and with that thought. So this is what it is for him. And then after that, there is kumbhaka, which other texts talk of as well, the retention of the breath. And he says, this is restraint of breath among the prabuddhas, the awakened ones, but for ajnana people, ignorant people, he's gone beyond just looking at tip of nose, it's tormenting the nose, granapidanam. These poor people, what are they doing? They're just tormenting their nose. So again, he's sort of trying to do this thing where he's like disparaging in order to include, and trying to sort of subordinate people from other groups into his own. And just to give you a little bit more of a few more of the angas, what does he say? Pratyahara is seeing the Atman, the sense, in all vishayas and all sense object. The mind is immersed in chit, in consciousness. That's what pratyahara is, to be practiced by those who want moksha, right? Desiring liberation. And then for him, what is samadhi? Samadhi, by means of the unchanging mental state. Again, he even says again, with the form of Brahman. So you're having the mental state, but it's not changing. So before you might have come in and out of it a bit, but it's unchanging and you forget all other mental states, vritti vismaranam. That is samadhi, which is the same as knowledge of Brahman. So he's telling us, okay, samadhi is knowledge of Brahman. However, we've still got 20 more verses to go. So this is not the end for him. But what is it? What is it for Patanjali? And of course, there are different kinds of samadhi, but he says samadhi absorption is when that very meditation shines forth as the only object, and it is as if empty of it, shunya, of its svarupa, right? So samadhi is a different kind of a state. We're not talking about Brahman here, right? We're talking about, again, this sort of discovery, realization of Purusha as separate from Prakriti. And what does the Hatha Pradipika say that samadhi is? He tells you, I'm going to teach you how to attain samadhi. What is it? It destroys death. It is the means to sukha, to happiness, and it's the best creator of the bliss of Brahman. So these Hatha Yoga texts start to bring things together in their own way. So they also say, yes, it can help you create the bliss of Brahman. And what is samadhi? Just like mixing salt and water, they become one. You can't separate them, right? They share an identity. In that same way, the aikyam, the oneness of the self and the mind, this is samadhi. So again, the Hatha Yoga texts, they also sort of they are defining samadhi in terms of oneness. However, they allow for all these other methods, right? Whereas so far, the Aparokṣānubhūti has not let us do that. But, it tells us one should practice. So he's reminding us a couple things. So one should practice this contemplation. And so the commentary says that it's contemplation. So it's the nididhyasana, right? So to not forget that these 15 angas, they were for the purpose of this contemplation, this nididhyasana, right? So we're still not at the end game here. One should practice this contemplation properly, which is this sort of unmanufactured bliss, ananda, until it is under control. And for a person who is absorbed, it can arise like instantaneously, spontaneously. So samadhi is still a state that you can come in and out of, right? And so you want to learn to have it under your control. But once you can do that, then the king of yogis, the yogi rock, becomes free from practices and becomes perfected. And the next verses, which I didn't put up here, but they then talk about the obstacles to samadhi, which are similar to the obstacles listed in chapter 1 of the Yoga Sutra, right? So you're not done yet. So you're practicing the samadhi, you can come into and out of it, but there's still obstacles, laziness, sleepiness, all kinds of distractions that will get in your way of samadhi. But he tells us, here's basically the end game, right? Having made the visible invisible, so we're no longer kind of attached to visible things, a wise person should what? Chintayet brahmakarena, consider it with the form of Brahman. Then what happens? Then he should remain in eternal sukha, eternal happiness, with his mind full of the delight of chit, of consciousness. So that's the end game. But if you're still here, don't worry. So he tells us a few things. What I told you about before, those 15 parts, I'm calling that Raja Yoga, right? Raja King. This is like the kingly, the royal yoga. This, together with its parts, And incidentally, Raja Yoga was used by, probably most prominently by Vivekananda for, to go with Patanjali's Yoga Sutra. So we have all kinds of different connotations for that, but he's not talking about Patanjali here when he says Raja Yoga. He's talking about my 15 angas and my definitions of them in terms of Brahman. They've been described together with their parts, but he says for those whose kashayas or kleshas, those whose afflictions have been only kinchit pakva, a little burnt, partly cooked, they're only half baked, basically. It can be joined with Hatha Yoga. Thank God, right? So for those of us who are still along the ride, he's like, okay, if you still are, this is the C student here, if you still haven't gotten it, okay, right? What does the Deepika tell us? Of whom the afflictions, beginning with attraction, beginning with raga, have been partly or a little burnt, meaning consumed by fire. This yoga, which is taught in the Upanishads, and it actually, I think he's referring here to the Yoga Upanishads, which were written in the 17th, 18th century. So, and there are a few of the Yoga Upanishads which quote the Aparokṣānubhūti. So I think that's what he means by the Upanishads here. And he's saying, okay, here it is joined with Hatha Yoga. But look what he's doing here. He's equating Hatha Yoga with the well-known Ashtanga Yoga of Patanjali. So for him, that Hatha Yoga is Patanjali's yoga. And he's sort of conflating those two together. My thing, Raja Yoga. Everything else, Hatha Yoga. And he says, the Vijnana Vinodini Tika, this other commentary says it should be joined with that Hatha Yoga in the form of restraints, such as pranayama is taught by Patanjali for the purpose of moksha, of liberation. This other commentary tells us, with respect to that, what is called Hatha Yoga is from seeing faults created by previous births, from samskaras. And he says, by the emphasis on this purpose of burning these afflictions, and how do you do that? By doing asanas, postural practice, and so forth. He tells us you can work with the chakras, by controlling the inhalation and exhalation. Again, the chakras. You can meditate on on more chakras. But this, he says, this is Hatha Yoga. So this is clearly a later commentary, it seems sort of referring, so the earliest commentary, the Deepika refers to Patanjali. These later commentaries refer more to what we think of as Hatha Yoga. But what does the Hatha Pradipika say about this? It says, Raja Yoga, Hattam Vina Raja Yoga, Raja Yogam Vina Hattaha. Raja Yoga is not attained without Hatha. Hatha is not attained without Raja. So he tells you, you have to do them together. So this is a very different opinion here. He says you should practice the pair of them until you accomplish the goal. And one of the other commentaries, the Deepika says, with Hatha Yoga means by the yoga that's taught in the work called the Hatha Pradipika. So he clearly has that as his framework. He says, for the attainment of the Atman, of the self, and it's joined with that practice for those whose afflictions are partly burnt. And then he says, the Hatha Pradipika, which cooks this, which burns this, it's for those who are excessively foolish. That's with reference to my work, meaning this text, but it's so easily accessible. Just do this and you will attain the self. Again, they're hitting us over the head here. And so how does the Aparokṣānubhūti leave us? So he says, at the point where your mind is fully cooked, completely mature, paripakva, this Raja Yoga alone is what gives you attainment. And then he tells us, for all those who are Guru Daivata Bhakta, devoted to the teacher and the deity, it is easy to attain at once. And it's funny, my reading group that I read the whole text with in Sanskrit, we spent like a year reading it at the end. And one of my students at the end got to it, it's like, why didn't you tell us that to begin with? It's like, it's easy if I do that. And it's like, okay, now start all over. And this time be devoted to the teacher and the deity. In the commentaries, the Vivarana says, for those whose minds are fully cooked, fully mature, this Raja Yoga alone, with the very characteristics that were previously spoken of, bestows attainment, not by Hatha Yoga. So he tells us we can do it, but he's telling us, that's really not going to get you there. Just going to get you a C. And, you won't get there. Together with hearing, together with Shravan, etc. But he says, for superior discerning people, this Hatha Yoga is an obstacle because it's artificial, it's fake, it's not really it's about the body, it doesn't tell you that the body is not the self, right? It's actually often helps, it often helps us confuse the body with the self, even though it's sort of meant to do the opposite. So it can be an obstacle. And the Bodhidipika says, for the purpose of attaining the self that is taught in several yoga texts, beginning with the Hatha Pradipika, first you have to set aside practices that produce afflictions, with meaning certain Hatha yoga things, by the practice of the means taught in this work alone, by its easy accessibility, saying this again, there is the attainment of Satchidananda, of existence, consciousness, and bliss. So saying, just read my text. That's all you got to do. And then we're going back a little. It's like, I told you this. Svatmanam Shrinumorkatvam. Listen, you fool. Learn about yourself, your spirit, through scripture, sacred knowledge, and reasoning. Beyond the body, Dehatitam, whose form is Sat, is true existence. Sududarsham Bapadrashaihi. So difficult to be seen by those like you. And I will keep reading the Aparokṣānubhūti. I always like to leave it at that place. I have no idea how long I talked for or what time it is, but I think we hopefully have time for questions. Yes, you're welcome to put, there's a question in the chat. Question from Swami Premananda. Since Swami Vivekananda was one of the great proponents of Advaita Vedanta, why, when he wrote his book on Raja Yoga, would he have presented Patanjali's Raja Yoga and not included the Raja Yoga of a main Advaitic text like the Aparokṣānubhūti? I mean, it's an interesting question. I mean, the Aparokṣānubhūti is not, that widely known, for one, although I would think, based on what I've read, I would think that Swami Vivekananda would have known it. And he actually uses the word Aparokṣānubhūti a fair bit. But, throughout, I didn't have time to talk about this today, but sort of throughout the history of Raja Yoga and Hatha Yoga, they keep being redefined, right? And everybody wants to define them. And so I would assume Swami Vivekananda wants to also sort of, this is Raja Yoga according to me. This is, and what does Raja mean, right? It means the royal yoga. So according to him, that was the royal yoga. So I think, he may have known about it, but he wouldn't necessarily, even if he knew about it, wouldn't necessarily have wanted to talk about it. You don't necessarily want to talk about the things that are contradictory, although commentaries do. Commentaries manufacture sort of other opinions. But yes, Swami Premananda said, yes, maybe he thought it would be more accessible in his time period. Absolutely. And that's what I was sort of, trying to say with this text also is, these texts are all responding to what was happening at that time. And so the Aparokṣānubhūti was responding to what was happening at that time. Swami Vivekananda was also responding to what was happening when he was teaching. In general, maybe not sort of once upon a time in a cave, but, since certainly, at a certain point, I think people realize, if you want your teachings to live, you have to bring people in, right? You want to keep the traditions alive. And so what do you do to you have to sort of draw people in. Why is yoga so popular today? Right? It's so popular because we've made it accessible. But it's the same thing they were doing here. It's just in a different way. These traditions have always been evolving in different ways. And so, I think it's one of the wonderful things about looking at these texts and looking at the tradition is watching how things change, watching how the meaning of Raja and Hatha Yoga change, watching for the ways in which Hatha and Raja Yoga change, watching for the ways that the word Nididhyasana changed. And yes, as Swami Premananda put in the chat, yes, this text, Swami Sarvapriyananda taught the whole thing, and like around the corner from my yogashala in New York at the Vedanta Center there, I got to go see a couple of his lectures, but the rest of them are all on YouTube and are wonderful, and it's a different perspective. I mean, when I went to listen to a lecture there, everybody in the audience was an Advaita person, whereas I always talk to yoga people. And so he was sort of telling them, you know, they were sort of like, what we were sort of getting into the verses about the yamas and the niyamas. I think it's like, why are you talking about yoga? Like, why bother with these yoga people? Like, what's the point? And he was sort of there saying like, no. Like, we want to interest them too. And, you know, we can kind of, you know, we can show them that it's about Brahman. And it is a really fun text to read. So I definitely, it's in shloka meter. It's all, you know, easily accessible text. Other questions? Eric, yeah.
But first of all, I really appreciate that you're discussing the truth, but really contextualizing. And I think you really highlighted the technical aspects of the text, which I found very interesting. It was kind of reminding me of the Buddhist text. For example, it kind of has a very similar structure where it starts off by saying this is truth, and it just kind of lays out the truth, and then goes through various practices, and then ends up at the very kind of what would be considered the lowest level practice, but actually kind of suggesting that even that very basic practice can lead you to that ultimate truth. So I think maybe something a little bit different is happening here. But I was curious if you can tell us about the idea of the very high level practice. I think there's a condition that hatha yoga is useless if you are a high level or highly perceptive practitioner, right?
The idea is that you don't need it.
So I'm thinking in the Buddhist context, sometimes they talk about high level bodhisattvas. I think there's a recognition that there's actually no actual very high level bodhisattva. It's an ideal, but the reality is that most people focus on these practices. But is that something that you see as going on here?
Absolutely. I mean, I think so. And I think that's why, you know, I mean, I'm sort of pulling out the joke aspect of it, but he definitely, there's a reason why he sort of says you can, you know, join it with hatha yoga. I mean, he's saying like, you can do this too. And if you practice hatha yoga, maybe eventually you'll practice Raja yoga. And if you practice Raja yoga, then, you know, maybe you won't need that anymore. And so absolutely. I mean, he's definitely trying to sort of tutor the C student to the B student to the A student. And that's how it definitely, the commentaries don't all necessarily read it that way, but I definitely take the text to mean it. I mean, there are some people who say the last two verses are actually possibly a later addition, which is also possible, that it's sort of, they were added in, again, to sort of bring people in and say, yes, start where you are. I mean, and to me, that is so important because that's, you know, those of us who teach and practice yoga, you know, that's what we do. I mean, most of us do not start yoga because of any high ideals. We start yoga, you know, because something hurts, or we start yoga, you know, maybe we want some kind of peace of mind, or maybe we want something, but we're certainly not like looking for kaivalya or for moksha or any of those things. And, you know, and it is a way in. And so I definitely think of this text as sort of playing a role in the evolution from the sort of renunciant tradition and sort of bringing in these sort of Advaitic concepts to make it more, you know, bringing them together to make it more accessible. But I would be interested to see that text. That awesome. Thank you. Sure.
I'm just curious if it could also be applicable to just the fluctuations of an individual's experience throughout the course of their life. So maybe like at different points of the day or moment to moment, you can be an A or a C or B, and you might forget, and then you can be like Just say, you fool, you know, to yourself. You forgot again, you know?
I mean,
Think of it like that.
that's interesting. I mean, honestly, I think sort of within those, there is that. So I think, like, I would say that if you're in that state, that's sort of part of the Raja Yoga. So if you're doing Hatha Yoga, you're not even aware enough to know that you're coming in and out. I think so much. Whereas I think if you're in the sort of Raja Yoga state, you know, there was all this talk about sort of coming in and out of, right? It's like you have this really, you know, you have, oh, here comes Brahman, oh, there goes Brahman. I have these other thoughts and trying to get Brahman. And that's why there are these 15 angas to kind of get you to. So I would say, you know, when you're practicing Raja Yoga, you're sort of coming in and out. And I would say sort of in the earlier stages, you don't need the more advanced student doesn't need Raja Yoga. So you're sort of more already there. So I think they're kind of, I think you can sort of move from being one to the other, but I think, again, I think like in his, at least in his sort of conception, they were kind of different tracks.
Oh, right.
Does the text give an idea of what a person would manifest or operate like seeing Brahman in all things? Does it lift up towards even mukta? Does it?
It doesn't. I mean,
Yeah.
I know. I would love to know that. Yes. What does this person do? I mean, you know, the thing about the prarabdha karma, right, is that it says that once you get there, you don't play out your prarabdha karma, which makes me think that there isn't jivamukti, you know, there isn't this state where you sort of, you've had some realization, but you're continuing to play things out. I mean, I always want it to be that way. I just want there to be some sort of state where you actually get to exist in this state. But there seem like some pretty aware states along the way when you're kind of almost there, but not quite. So I guess maybe there's that.
Yeah, because I was thinking of the Gunastanas in Jainism, where you get this 13th, where presumably the Tirthankara would be teaching, but it doesn't seem to describe the people who have landed there. So just curious.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, and the commentaries don't talk about that either. But it would be, yeah, interesting.
First of all, thank you for a wonderful talk.
Thank you.
My question is that it seems like in this system, the body is still relegated to sub-status. As you said, like the C student trying to like coaching the C student towards a B or an A. Where do you see this text as an intermediary between classical yoga and tantrism, or like where do you see it? Is it advancing the conversation towards welcoming the body as a locus of, you know, experiencing Brahman or non-duality?
Not so much. I mean, it's more sort of saying we misidentify, you know, all those, like all those, you know, and there are, I only showed you one, but there are a bunch of them, all these ones of like, all these verses about how could the body, way back at the beginning, you know, how could the body be the self, right? There's all this sort of misidentification. So it's saying, you know, that's, so people who are thinking that the body is the self, they're wrong. At the very end, when he talks about Hatha Yoga, he's probably including Tantra there, you know, in a certain, because Tantra sort of gets mixed into Hatha Yoga a bit. And so there it's like, so in Hatha Yoga, in Tantra, there you're sort of using the body, you know, more to kind of using the body to get beyond the body, right? Using the body as a vehicle to get beyond the body. Whereas here he's sort of saying like, no, like it's obvious, the body isn't the self. And so in the main portion of the text, he's saying like, that should be clear. And then even in Raja Yoga, for him, that should be clear. In Hatha Yoga, he sort of, I think that's where he kind of begrudgingly says, okay, you can use the body as a vehicle. That's like exactly what he's saying.
Last resort.
Last resort, yeah. I mean, he wants those people to come over to his side. So he's, you know, it's like, okay, you can do that. Maybe we'll rub off on you. You know? Yeah.
One question.
Sure.
Thank you for this. I really enjoy this text so much.
Thank you.
So my question is concerned with the overarching idea
Mhm.
of the text. And as you mentioned in the, I think, middle of your talk, that some people claim that this text may have compiled or added later some of the parts.
Mhm.
How do you see in if you when you look at the manuscript, are there manuscripts that are incomplete or that has not some of the parts?
There really aren't. There are actually some manuscripts that have some extra verses
Okay.
that actually try to bring in more of sort of a different kind of, you know, more sort of yoga and tantra kind of ideas. But I haven't seen any manuscripts that are missing these verses. So I'm not, again, I've heard that argument made, but I haven't actually, my evidence is I don't agree with that. I think it was part of.
So what's the overarching idea of the text? I know you just said the Kaivalya is the goal.
Well, Kaivalya is the goal of
the
yoga, of the Yoga Sutra. This text, the goal is realization of Brahman. So that's the goal. The end game is realizing that Atman and Brahman are the same. And his whole thing is trying to get you.
That's right.
Exactly. It's definitely, it's an Advaitic text. And the thing about Advaita is you can fit Dvaita inside, right? You can always have duality on the way to non-duality, right? There's no problem. There's no contradiction. The other way around, a little more complicated, but you can have Dvaita first and then it's like, okay, just take it one more step. And so that's kind of how it tends to get folded in. Thank you. Sure.
I'm trying to formulate it, so stay with me. So the body is spoken about in this way that is an illusion, that is something to remove identification from.
Mhm.
I'm curious about the role of the mind being in the body, yet somehow in the text, from how I'm hearing you, is somehow the vehicle to realize Brahman.
Mhm.
So could you speak a little bit more about maybe what the text might say about the role of the mind?
I mean, it's interesting, right? The mind is sort of, I guess, it's our tool. It's our tool for sort of, for that jnana and for recognition of that, distinction. And it's a very different, you know, we sort of, you know, I think these days we kind of talk about the mind-body divide, and but it's not that, you know, it's sort of a different construct. And so the mind is sort of more of a vehicle towards this jnana and realization and this sort of recognition of this separate, like non-identity.
I'm curious if the text at all said something about how we are not the mind or something like that.
No, that's interesting. I mean, it doesn't. I guess maybe that's something that more, I mean, partly because it's speaking to people misidentifying with the body. So I guess that's kind of, you know, it's like, that's definitely what he's responding to. I think he's less responding to people who identify and get stuck in the mind. I'm just guessing here because he doesn't actually talk about, I mean, he talks about the vrittis, right? He talks about the chitta vrittis in that sense, and sort of, you know, he had the nirodha of the chitta vrittis in his definition of pranayama and all of that. So he talks about the states of the mind, but he doesn't actually talk about sort of going, he doesn't talk about going beyond the mind the way he talks about going beyond the body. I mean, I guess you sort of just do. It's like at a certain point, it's the mind that helps you get, whereas according to him, like the body is never going to help you get there, whereas the mind sort of, can get you to this Shravana Manana Nididhyasana. It's like the mind is the vehicle of that. Me too. I've tried to ask him. He doesn't talk back.
Sharing. And I think my favorite part is where he's discussing how it would be torture to hold your breath and like, trying to get samadhi or like, these Brahmin, like the people that, because naturally it would cease, right? Like you would, like that would just naturally go away is the breath. But like people would torture themselves. I thought that was really funny. And I think that like this is actually
it's very relevant, right? And comical.
Text.
Yes. I know. It's Sanskrit humor. It's it is a thing. It's called hasa. It's a genre. I don't think that was what he was intending. But it is, I mean, it's one of the things that made me fall in love with the text. It's just, it's funny and
We're not laughing at you, we're laughing with you.
And thank you for the lovely comments, everybody.
Yeah, I want to thank everybody for being here. It's so lovely to be in a room with people, and I want to thank those of you who have been tuning in. And I also want to thank those who are viewing the recording of this. And I urge you to reach out if you would like more information about our programs. We are accepting applications for the Master of Arts in Yoga Studies, and we do monthly information sessions to which you are all invited, and they are on Zoom, so they are easy to access.
And there's one tomorrow.
And there's one tomorrow. They're actually live here. And I would like us to all give gratitude to Professor Slatoff in sharing this wisdom.
Thank you.
So good night all.
Thank you all for